Our next speaker will be Jasleen Kaur from Maryland. I'm really intrigued by your talk. Um, you've chosen to speak about death, Jasleen, which in most cases is uncomfortable. Tell us why you're daring to speak about this subject.
I grew up having a pretty good relationship with the idea of death because of how my parents kind of raised all of me and my siblings. My mom always kind of framed it as like a kind of returning, like a long-awaited return or a kind of going home, um, and collectively between me and my siblings, we've all experienced death at a pretty young age with like people our age. And so it was a thing that we kind of had to understand a little bit more growing up. Um, and there was always this kind of like emphasis on fostering like a relationship with death instead of a fear of it. And then, yeah, I don't know. I come across so many people who are afraid of it, and I get that. But uh, I actually found myself in college, like experiencing, friends losing people that they loved. And um, I just started to have that same kind of like thought about death. And it wasn't so much that it was a thing that was scary, but more that it was a thing that was like quote unquote bad, or a thing that took people away. And I remember really struggling with that. And finding myself kind of going away from what I knew to be true and understood to be true as a kid. And I remember having this dream, which like personal anecdote, but maybe it will give you a better understanding of where I sit now. Where I was like sitting in a room, my friend's dad had just passed away, and I saw this like, I guess what would be my brain's personification of death kind of come into the room. And I remember in the dream feeling that this was like the antithesis of all things kind of good and maybe like quote unquote holy. And so I started to like try to get it to go away by like invoking the gurus. I was like, get away from me. And I remember I sat down at this table with this personification that my brain had kind of concocted. And it pulled out like a sketch pad, and it had all these like paintings, and the kind of sentiment was like, this is just how it goes. Like, this is the universal experience, and everything that you finish, every book that begins must end, every painting that you begin must be finished, and like that's just the way it goes. And that felt like kind of a recall to how I was raised. And now like walking with Salok Mahala all these like months with the team, and really like being immersed in that, especially at a time where like death feels like it is swallowing all of us up, like all around us with this pandemic. I do think that it's an important thing for us to talk about, and sort of selfishly is a thing that has been important for me to like work through over the past year. And it is the constant in our lives, death and taxes. So yeah, we might as well try to figure out how to have that relationship, because it's not going anywhere. So
Yep. I think that the essence of what you mentioned is that in many ways, death, just like as Guru Sahib says, that inspires life, and the inspiration and lessons we get from the moments of death really do bring life onto us, and in that may well also be presented in the Mahala Nama Bani, and so I know you're going to speak on that today.
yeah.
Tell us your thoughts on Mahala Nama Bani and how you encountered it and your studies on it so far.
Yeah, so I mean, growing up, I feel like I heard a lot of people saying that it was a little bit too morbid or like depressing. And of course, like with the parents I have who have been kind of had like a good relationship with death, my mom was always like, I think it's so beautiful. And I was like, why is it that some people feel the exact opposite? And why is it that some people think it's so morbid? And I think something that I will discuss in my presentation and probably in the Q&A as well is like the gentleness of that Bani that has now come across after having worked with it with the team on the Guru Granth Sahib project. The like loving way that the Guru speaks to us and understands our condition. And I think sometimes we read that nuance out of things because it's easier to be hard on ourselves about where we are in our journeys. And so, yeah, if I can get one thing across even before the presentation starts, it's that the biggest shift for me in understanding this Bani has been with the like tone and the gentleness and the kind of forgiveness that kind of permeates the whole thing, and how life-changing that is for me, and I hope it will be for other people as well.
That's a great segue into an item that I think what we all try to do, which is immersion. And hopefully your presentation will help us in that immersion process of Gurbani to come. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Jasleen. We look forward to the presentation.
Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Today I'm going to be talking about exploring death in Salok Mahala Nova, some background on why I've decided to talk about this today, outside of just like working on it in the Guru Granth Sahib project. I've thought a lot, especially in the past year, as like a lot of people have passed away due to the pandemic and due to the farmers' protest. I've thought a lot about death and how we conceive of it. And how it's this thing that we all experience and we all have to go through ourselves, but it seems like a thing we are constantly learning how to understand and live with. And a lot of times we don't understand it, and a lot of times our relationship with it is one based in fear. And I grew up sort of with a uniquely healthy relationship with death because of how I was raised and the experiences I had as a kid with death. But I did find myself losing that relationship as I got older, and kind of lived long enough in the world to see that a lot of people are afraid of it, or if they're not afraid of it, they think of it at least as like kind of a dark and bad thing. And so I wanted to take this Bani that a lot of people see as being about death in general and put it in conversation with both like popular understandings that we have of death outside of maybe like the religious world, and also Sikh understandings of death, and how sometimes we take our fear and we read it back into the Banis that we're looking at. So I wanted to start with looking at just like popular conceptions of death. So I thought just a lot about how we talk about like the Grim Reaper and death as a thing to avoid and a thing to fear. I think that a lot of our popular Sikh understandings kind of imbibe those popular understandings despite what Bani tells us. I remember talking to my grandpa a little bit about this, and he always quotes these lines where it's like death is going to take you and beat you over the head and seize you by your hair, and I've put a line here where the translation talks about death being on the prowl with its mouth wide open. And so I don't think that fear of death is based in nothing. I don't think that we're not getting that from somewhere. But I think what we tend to do is like read these lines about death being personified as this like scolding and aggressive thing, this thing that is kind of hovering over our heads, just waiting to snatch us up. And we don't read the lines that come before and after those lines that tell us about how our ideas about death, as this thing to be feared, are not based in reality, that like this is a thing that we all must do. And those lines really are just about how we conceive of death. And so what we tend to do is, even in Shabads that offer us antidotes to our fear, we tend to just focus on the lines that amplify that fear. And so I wanted to talk about death in Salok Mahala Nova because of all of this. And I wanted to just start before we get into it by saying that I believe in my own kind of understanding of this Bani, and having sat with it for the past few months, I do think that it is a very gentle and loving Bani, and I didn't think that before. And I'll explain more what I mean by that later on, but I find it like very encouraging, very gentle, very soft in a lot of places. And when it's not soft, I think the Guru does a purposeful kind of narrative shift to make things in the first person, even though they're talking to all of us. And I think that it's this gentle kind of shaking out of forgetfulness and shaking into remembrance that is repeated throughout the lines that I find so like loving and patient. So I'll talk about some key themes. We see death as the greatest fear that humans have, is the fear of death. And that is pointed to in a lot of places in Gurbani. But that fear is not rooted in anything other than our own ideas about our lives and the ends of our lives. And because of that fear, death is this great kind of paralyzer. But the Guru takes those ideas and actually frames death as this great reminder, as this universal experience that can be the thing that nudges us into remembrance, the things that we came here to do with our human lives. And I think the Guru is kind of posing a question through all these saloks of like, what does it mean to do what we are here for, and how does that action, how does that change in our behavior cause death to kind of lose its terror? I don't think that this Bani is just about death. I think it's about something much bigger than that, if I can say that. But I will say that the poetic devices that the Guru uses are, again, pushing for that like gentle tone, that loving tone, the constant like introspection and self-address, and the repetition that on its own actually tends to sound like how it sounds when your thoughts are going through your head again and again, coming back to the same ideas again and again, gently, as if it's this kind of circular thought process that's happening in our own heads, I think is so beautiful. He addresses the mind, he addresses the being, he addresses the self, he calls us friend, he also calls us crazy people, which I think when I first read it I thought was a little bit harsh, but then I kind of thought of it more like how when you're a kid and your parents are like, calm down for a second, it's gonna be okay, you're being crazy, you're being mad. And I think that that's kind of the understanding I have now that I've sat with it for a little bit longer. And then he does this thing where he takes us through all of the kind of ways that we can move through our paths and develop as human beings who are meant to remember, who are meant to praise and identify. And he takes us to the proverbial mountain and then brings us back down every so often to say, I know all this is overwhelming. And I know that I'm asking you to do a lot. And I understand that you're a human in the world and this is your condition. And it's hard to like kind of detach yourself from the constant entanglements that come up as you live a life in the world. But he simplifies it every so often and says, like, if you just do this every day and night, I promise you this will happen. I promise you you'll feel the presence. I promise you you'll be able to get rid of your fear and your ego and you'll be free. So I've put a whole bunch of lines here because I want to really emphasize that this is repeated throughout from the very beginning to the very end. And it's this theme of like praising and remembering and identifying with Ikonkar, with the one light, which is our translation of Hari, with the earth knower, our translation of Govind. And there's this kind of like singing that he starts with. So it's like this physical beginning, because later when he talks about it, he says like, I know I've told you to do all these things, but just like sing the praises every day. And like that physical thing, starting at the tongue and starting at the ears, with your physical senses, that's the way to begin. He brings it back to like, what is the simplest way to begin praise? What is the simplest way to move into remembrance? And it's to begin by listening to identification of with the one light with your ears. It's by praising the virtues of the earth knower with your tongue. These are things that we can all do. And if we can't sing, it happens. If we can't sing, we can listen. And if we can't listen, we can feel. And we have these senses as humans in the world, and they're gifts. And maybe right now, because, it's the nature of the human condition, maybe our senses are steeped in a kind of flavor that is temporary. Maybe our senses are overwhelmed by the temporary and we are forgetting what we came here for. But we can move out of that and use those same senses for something bigger. And he says that behavior and that like making that into a habit allows us to become free in the world, because we are no longer full of fear. We are no longer consuming and accumulating all of our things and thinking of them as ours, which is not to say like don't have things, don't have relationships, don't love your family. It is to say don't let your emotions and your attachments drive your behavior. Feel your feelings. That's a gift too, right? Feelings are a part of the senses, but also never think of these things as yours. And if you don't think of them as yours anymore, you won't be so terrified all the time of losing them. So I think that that's really powerful. He talks about this kind of steadiness that happens when we're detached, and it's not the detachment of a renunciate. in the classical sense. It's the detachment of someone who is a person in the world, who has relationships and things and experiences those relationships, but they are rooted in the eternal and not the temporary. And when we do that, our fear of death goes away, because we know that that love that we have and those relationships that we have, we're not rooted in such temporary things. And maybe people leave the physical world, but that's not the end. And he talks about how all of this can turn you into like a carefree person. He uses the metaphor of like a wall of sand to talk about the world. And he talks a lot about the kind of temporariness of the world. And when we were talking about that in the commentary meetings, we talked about how like when kids build a sandcastle and then they like wait for it to be high tide and they watch with glee as it kind of dissolves back into the ocean. And that kind of carefree thing of like building up your castle, yes, accumulating your thing, putting your effort into some kind of worldly comfort or worldly thing. Sure, do that. But can you let it go when the tide comes? Can you live in a way where you're not afraid of losing the castle? So I think that's one big theme. And then kind of building off of that, talking about the human condition. One of the things that I think is so gentle about this Bani is that Guru Teghbahadar Sahib constantly says, like, I understand. I understand that this is part of what you're experiencing because you're a person in the world. But I'm asking you to keep recognizing that the things in front of you and the things that you have are not all that there is. I'm asking you to zoom out, look at things from an aerial perspective, and live knowing what the real kind of purpose is. And so he reminds us multiple times, you know, your wealth and your spouse and your property, you cannot believe those things to be your own. And like no one is your constant companion. And I think a lot of times when we talk about these kinds of lines, we're like, yeah, we have to detach from our family members and we have to not have relationships. And that's not what he's saying, because he also had relationships in the world, but he lived with that carefree kind of mindset that takes effort to build and inculcate. And so when it came to losing things, he knew that he wasn't really losing things that were his. And part of what I really like is that towards the middle of the Bani, he says, you know, you made so many efforts to be comfortable. You didn't make any efforts to rid yourself of pain and suffering. An example that we used in the commentary was like the way that we're constantly kind of trying to like build our resume and further our job and like build ourselves up in our careers and just like all of these kind of tangible worldly things. And then when it comes to like the internal, we tend to kind of let our like mental and emotional health slide. And so he's saying like, I know that you've done this and I know that this is part of your condition. And then he says, this all happened within the command, within the will of the one light. And I am telling you that I understand your condition and so does the one. And there's something like deeply comforting about that, because there's never like a moment where Guru Teghbahadar Sahib is like scolding us or telling us that it's too late. He's being very understanding because he knows what it is like to struggle with these things day to day. And that brings us to the next theme, which is that it's never too late. It's not too late. And so he uses this phrase, Batat Udaran, which we talked a lot about as a team, and discussed it as like the emancipator of the fallen, the one who frees those who stray. Maybe you're not, you know, doing the things that you want to be doing. Maybe you got distracted. Maybe you built up all your attachments and your entanglements and you think that it's too late. But even then, the one Ikonkar, the one light, is the one who frees those who have strayed, is the one who dispels our fears and helps the helpless. And there's this reminder that we ought to know, even when we're overwhelmed, when we're drowning in our worldly things, and we think that it's too late, the one always dwells with us. And then I brought this last stanza in because towards the end, Guru Sahib is saying, you know, physically, your head has started to kind of tremble. You can't maybe think as well. Maybe you can't like imagine things in the same way that you used to be able to when you were a kid. Your eyes have become devoid of light. Your feet have started to kind of wobble. Even then, he is saying, we don't immerse ourselves in the essence, in the identification of the one. And the implication there is that like, you should still be doing it even now, even if you think it's too late and like you're fading physically. Why aren't you doing it now? And so this idea that it's like too late or no longer possible is not there at all. And I think that that's such a gentle and like loving message to give to us. I just wanted to end with a few questions because I will not sit here and tell you that I've figured it out. I haven't. I'm still very much walking with this Bonnie, and I think will be for the rest of my life, because that's kind of, I mean, death is a thing forever. So I'm sure I'll come back to it. I would like to leave you with 4 questions. Will we learn the lessons that death has to teach us? That things are temporary, that our purpose in this world is to remember and praise and identify with Ikonkar. And will we foster a relationship with death in place of our fear? Will we be able to confront death in a way that is forgiving to ourselves and just like loving, instead of based in being afraid? Will we begin to walk the path of praise, remembrance, and identification, which is also, a question about, will we begin to walk the path of freedom? Even though it is overwhelming to live a life in the world and to be afraid and to be worried all the time about losing things, the thing that I want to leave everyone with, that I keep coming back to, so maybe it'll help you too, is that in that Salok, the Guru says, start with the tongue, start with the ears. Do this physical praise and it will move you into remembrance. Do this remembrance and it will move you into identifying with the one, and it will take your fear from your body. It'll free you. So I guess I will leave you with that. That's all I have for my presentation. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to the discussion. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Jasleen, for that wonderful presentation that is just that we just concluded. And the questions that have come forth are obviously in some ways similar to what you've asked. And we also welcome Sundarpal Singh back as part of our panel discussion for this segment. And I know that one of the things that you mentioned at the very end, Jasleen Kaur, was about freedom. Because when you said that Salok Maula isn't really about death, and it's about being free, can you talk more about your ideas on that, and where else that might be reflected in Gurbani?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I guess I did trick people a little bit with the title of the talk, but I think I would. I mean, this is my understanding, so take it with a pound of salt. But I think the use of death in Gurbani, not just in this particular Bani, is really about what our greatest fear is and what we see as the kind of greatest end to our lives from our small kind of perspectives. And so it makes sense that that's the greatest reminder for us. You could say the same for like reminders about time. Death kind of functions in that way. I think the Bani is about attachment and fear and how paralyzing those things are, and that includes the fear of death, this kind of greatest fear of ours. But a thing that is constantly referred to is this idea of freedom throughout the Bani as well. And I think if you think about like other places where death is mentioned in Gurbani, there's like lines that say like the one who has like killed their ego, so they're dead while they're alive. Like there's references to that a lot of the time. And it can be confusing, but it's about this kind of understanding of our lives outside of maybe the like lines of life and death and the ways that we think about them. And that freedom is not something that is granted to us when we leave the earth, that we can strive for freedom, and we ought to strive for freedom while we're still alive, because this is the time that matters. This is the time that we are given these bodies and these lives, short as they may be, these bodies temporary as they may be, to engage in remembrance. And so, yes, it's not about death. Yes, it's about freedom. I think one of the words that's used is like gut in the Bani, if I'm remembering correctly, which actually has like a root word that refers to movement. And so I think when we talk about death as this great paralyzer and what it means to move, to be able to actually move in the world and be free and carefree, I think that's really what the takeaway is here. It's about not being so afraid or paralyzed by our attachments, in that we kind of spend day to day either like worrying about accumulating more or worrying about losing what we have. And so I think the freedom comes when we can kind of see the larger picture and get out of that. We talk about a cage in the commentary, but that kind of cage of fear. Yeah.
And Jasleen ji, I thought that that comment at the very end about immersion
Hmm.
and being free brings it together for the conscious. You have to be free to immerse into the body. And I think that's really, obviously there's blessings to go along with it. Thank you for the additional explanation, and we'll come back to you in a minute. And I'd like to take the next question to Sundarpal Singh ji. Sundarpal Singh ji, could you speak a little bit about the kindness as an expression of the Guru in the realms of all that you spoke about, family, political, and the societal side? What does kindness play a role, and how?
I think kindness as a human quality is something very beautiful. But when we look at it from a Sikh perspective, when we look at the Guru personality and we say the Guru is kind, that I think idea of kindness is coming from a very different place, as I observe, as I see it, or as I experience it. It's coming from a place of absolute understanding or absolute love, which is divine love, and which is not relative in nature. It's the kind where one rises above the relativities of life. That's how I like to explain it, this idea of relativities of life versus the absolute aspect of life. And that's where the Guru consciousness resides. So when the Guru is kind, Guru isn't kind in a particular mundane way, but in a way where the Guru sees the divine in everyone. So it's that kind of kindness, which is full of love, empathy, based on seeing the divine in everything.
That's, I think, another great example of how we can bring into real life the examples of Guru Sahib. And that is what you mentioned, brings us to compassion and brings us to the kindness that we need to express for both in our family, but what's beyond our family. Because for the human family, it's that worldly consciousness that we need to ensure that we have. And only the Guru can give that to us. One of the things about Salok Melanoma, Jasleen Kaur ji, is detachment and Bairag, as one of our individuals in the chat room presented a little bit. Speak to us a little bit more about Bairag, detachment, and freedom through your learnings of Salok Melanoma.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think something I've been thinking about is like maybe the reason we're so afraid of like death is also because we think of our relationships as temporary, or we think about them as things that we are not really supposed to have. I think we tend to think about renunciation or detachment in kind of classically religious sort of frameworks where maybe you're not physically going to a mountain to like isolate from your family, but there's like a harshness that we read into ideas of detachment and renunciation. And I think within this body, something that is really, really like hammered across multiple times is that this kind of renunciation and detachment is not the same as what we think it is when we think of like a yogi or a sadhu sitting somewhere far away from their family. It is not to say that we do not love the people around us and have relationships and care for them. It's not even to say that we don't seek comfort in the world, because I think sometimes we also think that we're not supposed to like seek like material comforts. That's okay. But are we attached to them? Do they drive us? And so it's that difference between like having these things, accumulating them because that's part of like being a human in the world. And the Guru's not asking us to not be of the world, but what does it mean to be carefree about the things that you have? I had used that like sandcastle analogy that we had talked about in the commentary meetings. it's this idea of like not being driven by our emotions and our feelings and our attachments, whether those are relationships or material things. It's not being redirected by the temporary. It's kind of being centered on the eternal and also being of the world. And so there's like a great nuancing that happens when we're talking about what it means to be detached or what it means to be a renunciate while being of the world. And it's like, can you live in the world and have these things and have these relationships? And also, can every breath be remembrance? Like, can every breath be praise? Can every breath be one that like helps you inculcate those virtues of the one? So there's not this like harsh kind of like punishing of like being a person in the world. We didn't sign up to get these bodies and come here, but what are we doing with our time and our lives and our energy? And what are we seeing as important? Are we zooming out and understanding what we came here for? So I think that there's like because I mean, you said we live in a world of paradoxes, like because we're people, we tend to like read things really in a really binary way. And I think in this Bani, the Guru is doing a really important thing, which is like adding nuance to that idea so that we don't feel so like guilty and we don't feel like it's such a difficult thing to do. We all have that potential. Yeah.
Thank you, but I would still want to come back to paradox because it is constant struggle. Pal palte, every single instance, we're having that struggle of compassion, kindness, and freedom to the malevolence, the attachments that we all have. That's something we all struggle with on a moment by moment basis. And I want to come back to that later. But for the moment, I wanted to go back to Sundarpal Singh Ji because he mentioned also renunciation in his presentation. And I wanted to find out if you could please share additional detail about countering these stereotypes about Guru Teghbahadar Ji's life and personality about renunciation, and how that contextualize that into today's world for our lives as well, Sundarpal.
Yeah, sure. But I would like to slightly speak to the question, you posed in earlier, and because this idea of detachment comes quite often. And I personally believe most of us, most of the times are torn between, we see it as, either this or that. But the reality is what the Guru is guiding us to do is to develop the love of Ek Onkar in a way that's the only love you seek. For instance, there's a Salok where it says, develop the love of Ek Onkar like the fish loves the water. Just as the fish cannot see life beyond water, you have to see your existence through that. But most of the times we understand faith or religion in a very superficial way, where we have our personal lives, we separate from our quote unquote religious life. And then we try to quote unquote balance them. And that's where the problem arises. Guru Sahib is not saying that, keep two separate lives and try to balance them. What Guru Sahib is saying is that develop that one absolute love through which you need to learn to deal with your worldly affairs. And when that happens, when you have developed that love, then everything becomes intuitive. Then you don't have to do these mental gymnastics of trying to create frames in the mind of what is detachment, what is attachment, and how do I balance that.
Thank you for the additional detail and description. I love it. I just hope that we can all continue to work on our efforts to apply it, because that is a daily struggle. I wanted to ask on a more specific item for you, Jasleen Kaur, and that is, you mentioned poetic devices in your presentation in Salok Mahala. And maybe both of you can speak a little bit more about those poetic devices, yourself and Sundarpal Singh Ji, and having both worked on this Gurbani during the Guru Granth Sahib Seed project. So please, Jasleen Ji first.
Yeah, so I mentioned kind of the general poetics that I found to be important in creating that like gentle and loving tone. Something I kind of want to re-emphasize, because we are talking about this like daily struggle, is there's like, I don't know if I can say like a dance of the Saloks, I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, but they're not like entirely linear. There's like a couple of times where the Guru takes us through like kind of takes us along on a path. We said in the commentaries, takes us up the mountain and then kind of comes back down to where we are. So there's this kind of like play that even happens within the Saloks where it's like, yes, this is overwhelming. I'm just showing you where you can get, but I'm going to come back down to your level. And I think that that's really lovely. I also wanted to talk about two like specific things that I didn't mention in the presentation. The use of eulogy is what we have called it on the team, of like multiple attributes, multiple names of Ikonkar being invoked. So we have like Gobind, the earth knower, Hari, one light, or the all pervasive, or in some places like the dispeller of fear. We have that emancipator of the fallen. We have the helper of the helpless, the adorable one, the one who ought to be adored. And so I think, this is my reading of it, I think when we tell people to remember or praise, right? If that's our goal, giving us those kinds of like threads to pull at, of like different kind of facets of the one that we can, that we can identify with, I think is a really like beautiful and like helpful tool in a way for like us as seekers. What resonates with you? You know, what speaks to you? It doesn't have to be all the attributes on the same sort of level, but those are ways to identify with the one. When we talk about like, oh, you know that person, tell me about them. When you know somebody better, you can name more things about them, right? They're not just, oh, that person is nice. It's, you know, they love their family, they're kind, they're all these things. So that kind of like relationship with the one, I think, is really being emphasized through invoking so many of those attributes. I also wanted to talk about the word gut, which I don't know if I've said that right because I'm, you know, bear with me, but pitcher. And this like, this symbol of the pitcher being used for the heart and the body. And we see that in Asakiwar too. We see like this metaphor of like the vessel being invoked at the very end for the body. And I've thought a lot about like what that means and like what are we filled with and what are we like kind of pouring out all around us. How do our like internal changes in behavior and thought affect the external world and like vice versa. There's two Saloks where Guru Sahib like invokes this idea of the dog. And there's the one Salok that starts as like, when a body that doesn't have remembrance is one that is like the body of a pig or a dog. And it's this idea of like consuming filth, kind of like being greedy, never satisfied, with dogs, like stray dogs, like wandering around. But then in the very next Salok, he keeps that symbolism of the dog and talks about a dog that is kind of like trained, who stays in the dwelling of the owner, who remembers the owner at all times, who sings praises like single-mindedly with this like focused mind. And that I think ties into this idea of like, what is a vessel? You can have the body of a dog, you can have your vessel, and you can change what it is internally, and that's what matters. So I think that even that like play that he does with the dog being this like filth consuming thing, and then this utterly loyal and like devoted thing, is really beautiful. And it further emphasizes that we have that potential to take these bodies, the body doesn't change, but to take them kind of from the inside out and change them. So those were two specific things that, I wanted to mention.
Thank you, Jasleen. Can you please discuss a little bit about the poetic devices in Salok Melanoma?
A little bit. I don't have any specific poetic device in mind, but I do have a few ideas that come to mind when I think of what just been said, and to my previous idea of, the fish in the water. Guru Sahib uses this idea of fish in the water. If I can use that analogy, it's like saying that you are in the water, but most of the times I'll use another, slok here. It says, "Jo supna ar pekhna, aise jag kho jaan." Know this word as a play or as a dream. Inme kach sacho nahi nanak bhagwan. Without that ikonkar, that Bhagwan, there's nothing real or true in this. So the idea behind real or truth here is that everything is real because everything is divine, because everything is flowing within the divine, because the divine is the water. Without the water, there is no life within the water. If we look at the paradigm of the example of the fish, sorry. So the point is, even though everything is true, but what's happening is that the creature is, or we are unaware of the water around us, and we are just focused on the food that's floating in the water. And that's why this water has become a dream for you. And that's also the reason for most of the pains in your life. And then, it's in that context that Guru Sahib says, the person who has given up this detachment, quote unquote, which is more of actually being aware of the water around me, that's when I'm actually udas. So while I'm looking for my food and I'm eating it, I'm also udas because I'm aware of that water around me. So that really, intrigues.
I think both of you, what you said really brought it together while you were speaking to me in the context that that immersion process of Gurbani and us as our human souls, it's so important for us to let go of that attachment and detachment and virag that are presented in Salok Melanoma give us the pathway to be able to do that. And I think that really, both of yours explanation brought that into light for me. Moving to in a similar section, I know that we've talked a lot about detachment. We've talked a lot about virag. Just as a final item, did either of you want to say anything more about virag or detachment and Guru Teghbahadar Ji's life and Bani?
Jasleen?
I guess an example that we use in the commentary that might be helpful for people when they're trying to think about this is one that's common in Gurbani is like the lotus, and the lotus like sitting on top of the water, connected but like untouched by the kind of like dirt and filth that exists, beneath the surface. So being able to kind of like float on the surface is, I think, where we're trying to be, and maybe that's a visual that will help people after they leave this session.
Thank you. Sundarpal Singh ji?
Yeah, so there are a few things, I would like to focus here. There's a running theme throughout the Bani, and one of the major themes within that is the limits of human life and the awareness of death and the purpose of life. Steven spoke to beautifully. The idea that it's when we are forgetful both our limits as human beings and the ultimate truth of inevitability of the taxes and the death. So those two things. So when we are aware of that, that's when we actually start our journey. That's our starting point. So being aware of death and the purpose of life. The next thing is once you're aware of that, what do you do in life? You learn to deal with your relationships around you, learn to deal with your aspirations of life, where you want to take your life, and the most important question of power and wealth. That's where most of the problems arise from, human aspirations to own, possess, whether it's relationships or wealth. And that's where the Guru guides us that even though they are true, but they're not really true in the sense that because they're not permanent, even though they are within the creation. So we need to develop a relationship with them, keeping in mind that they're as transitory as we are, and they are just they're just with us along the path for our lives to sustain. And then the other thing, that one very important major theme that Jasleen also touched was what is liberation. And as I mentioned, the idea of the absolute versus the relativity. So what Guru Sahib tells us that once we have developed that love of the divine, we are able to rise above the relativities of life. And he actually uses 3 consecutive sloks, and then he says a person who is away from both happiness and sorrow, a person who is away from both sides. Actually, he balances it. He brings both sides and not just one. Greed and attachment and pride. One who is away from both praise and slander, and for whom both iron and gold mean the same. And that's the kind of person we want to become. That's the kind of detachment we want to have. And that's when in the later lines of the same sloks, he says, we actually truly become free, or we actually truly become, divine life.
Yeah, thank you both for those explanations. While you were talking, one of the things I was trying to tie together was between what you presented in these discussions and Harinder Singh's topic of benevolent warrior, and the quality for liberation, the quality for looking at death, and for being a warrior is courage. We all, that's a quality that we all should ask for blessings from our Guru, for courage, so we can remain detached while we live in this world, while we get ready to face death, and while we want ourselves and humanity to be liberated. And I think that really brought something. It was good to hear your in-depth discussions about that, because it allowed me to get a better understanding, and I hope the audience a better understanding how we can bring this into our lives as well. Having worked closely with Teghbahadar's Bani and history for both of you, how has your understanding of the Guru and the Guru's Bani changed or evolved? Jasleen, if you'll go first, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'll just reiterate the same point, which is that, yeah, that like kind of harshness and that fear that we tend to read into things as human beings, those dichotomies we tend to read into even like Bani, which so often says, what? It's not what you think it is. It's not, things aren't so binary as you think they are. Everything is, if we're going to talk about Ikunkar, like, don't read that into things, but we do. And I think it's a thing that we kind of always have to be aware of and try to come out of. So that like gentleness and lovingness that has come out of this Bani has actually helped me form more like of a personal relationship with Guru Teghbahadar Sahib. If I can say that, I think like, we can all sit here and tell you guys like this is who Guru Teghbahadar Sahib was, but each person has a unique relationship with the Guru and like ought to continue to foster that. And so a thing that we had said a couple years ago when we did a conference for Guru Nanak Sahib was like, if we can come away from something, from hearing all these different sort of facets of Guru Teghbahadar Sahib's life and Bani, if we can come away with one thing that we can pull at, like a thread that we can pull at as individuals, something that resonates, then that's where like the beginning of that intimate relationship comes from. And that's a gift. So I feel very lucky that I've gotten to kind of walk with this Bani and sort of maybe kookily talk to Guru Teghbahadar Sahib in my head and be like, wow, good job on that line. But yeah, I mean, that's what we're after, is like that personal relationship. And so, yeah, it's given me that. And I feel very, very lucky. And I hope other people can come away from this starting to pull at those threads a little bit.
Thank you, Jasleen Ji. Sundarpal Singh Ji?
Yeah, I think that's what I'll where she left the idea of personal relationship, the thread, as I mentioned earlier, most of the times we look at divine love as a one box, one separate facet of life, which we have to fulfill and just check, and we are done with it. And that's where the problem lies. When I travel with the Bani of Guru Teghbahadar Sahib, as soft, as gentle, and as warm as it is, like all of us, not stereotyping there, it gently reminds me that most of your fears, most of my fears, most of my pains and sufferings in life are because of not developing that absolute love and that awareness. If I'm able to develop that awareness, that's when I'm speaking, when I'm uttering phrases, when I'm aware, that's when I'm alive. That's the kind of state Guru wants me to be in. If I'm able to do that, I think I'm close to it.
Thank you both very much. And as the chat indicated, and my own sense, that when you were both speaking, what's really coming through today in both your presentations and your discussion is that personal relationship we have with our Guru and with Bani. That personal relationship is what's going to enlight us, going to provide us guidance and provide us the courage to continue to feel liberated and feel blessed. Really want to thank both of you, Surinder Singh ji, Jasleen Kaur ji, for being so open in answering the questions that have come forth. And I think I missed one or two questions from the chat, so I'm sorry about that. But looks like we have a couple of minutes. There is a simple question, hopefully one of you can answer. And this individual asked that they were listening to a katha about the absolute last part of Salok Mahala Noma, after Bal Chutkyo Bandhan Pare. The Kathavachik was saying that the last part of the only part of the Gurbani added by Guru Gobind Singh Ji himself, if you understood that correctly. Is there any information on that? If either of you like to speak.
Well, there's research on this, but there's no direct documentary evidence to suggest that. I think most of this Bani was revealed by Guru Teghbahadar Sahib himself. And even though its revelation has been, contextually placed at different places and different situations based on how people perceive it, but I don't think there's any documentary evidence available.
Thank you. Thank you. Jasleen ji?
Yeah, I was just going to say that when this Bani comes out on the Guru Granth Sahib Project website, you'll be able to read a little bit about that information. The research team did a lot of research on that. And yeah, I'll just echo Surinder and say that they've come to the same conclusion. So yeah, that'll be offered on the website in more detail.
Great. Great. We look forward to that. And thank you both once again, for all the information you've provided, your transparency, your openness, your honesty, your feeling of real attachment to the Guru. We talked about detachment a lot, your real attachment to the Guru. And that really came through for me and for the audience. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much, both of you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.